this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. On this episode, we are talking about rewiring emotional responses. So this is sort of the crescendo and finale to our series on emotions, which was actually part of a series on the Hebrew concept of the soul, which is mind, will, and emotions. So, Rise to Reign framework is 7 principles applied to 7 categories. And the categories are body, soul. That's one category, which exists in 3 parts, which is the body, the mind, the will, and the emotions is the complex of the soul. And so with this, we're wrapping up emotions. We did mind, we did will, and now we're wrapping up emotions. And that wraps up the category of soul. So I'm doing a little bit of a mini series inside this where in episode 29, I started off on a 3-part series of emotional intelligence. And that is episodes 19, 20, and 21. In episode 22, I talked about emotional addiction. In episode 23, I talked about trauma, and then we talked about core wounding, and now we're talking about rewiring emotional responses. So that's kind of like all of the what leading up to this, and this is the what do we do about it. Because once we understand how trauma is laid down and how our central nervous system is patterned, we can then do something about it. When we understand emotional equilibrium and addiction, we understand our default settings and we can choose something different and begin the process of rewiring our emotional responses. Now, I say rewiring because we're actually talking about a process of when we experience a trigger, it's a triggering event, a button is pushed and that wire sort of goes to a certain trauma or a wound. And it elicits a certain reaction. That reaction is the pattern. So we want to rewire. We want to decouple that button and attach it to a different response. That's the rewiring analogy. So that we aren't unconscious in our patterns and we actually get to choose how we show up, which actually allows us to have an incredible amount of sovereignty and agency over all of our experiences and relationships in life and what we are able to create and manifest in the world. In order to repattern or rewire our emotional responses by repatterning the central nervous system, we have to first send the signal of safety to our nervous system physiologically and emotionally. So a lot of us, most of us actually, without even realizing it, have lived in such survival mode, fight or flight, activation of the sympathetic nervous system that we're not even aware that we're under a constant state of stress from trauma and childhood patterning. So the step 1 is to send the signal of safety to our body physiologically. And we do that by eating healthy food, getting plenty of rest, taking our supplements, hydration, oils, breath work, exercise, all the ways that we take care of our body really helps ground. Earthing, walking barefoot on grass or sand on the beach, really helps ground the body. And we want to send that signal of safety to the nervous system. The second thing is emotionally. So that we do this with boundaries on draining or abusive people, monitoring and adjusting our self-talk. What are we allowing into our space as far as media that we consume, social media, etc. So it's really important to create an environment of safety as you're doing this work because you want to be able to have like sort of a baseline feeling of safety. Next, we work on triggers as they show up to slowly and methodically empty out the toxic tank. So the toxic tank is sort of the euphemism that I use for all of the negatively perceived adverse experiences and trauma that you've locked into this tank, this toxic tank, and it's under there just seething and fermenting and leaking poison out into your life and causing all kinds of problems. And the process of healing is really uncovering and emptying out, cleaning out that toxic tank. And I will say this, for emotional repatterning, you have to heal it to feel it. It goes out the way that it came in. So emotions buried alive never die. So there's a framework that I use called TRIP. And that's an acronym for trigger, response, interrupt, interrogate, and then presence and power. So it works like this. Something happens and that's your trigger. Okay. So you get cut off in traffic, or you get that look from your husband, or your mom calls and you hear your mom's voice, or you open a bill. And so all of those events can be a trigger, and they activate a response. That's the pattern. So you open that bill and you automatically go into anxiety, or your mom calls and you automatically go into defensiveness, or you see a cupcake and you go into craving and temptation. Any manner of things can trigger a response, a conditioned response. So what we want to do is we want to come conscious in this pattern. So the response is your body's and your physical and your emotional response. So there's the trigger and then there's the response. That sort of happens outside of our control or conscious awareness. But where we do have the opportunity is to come conscious right at that point of the response and ask some questions. And so this is the I and trip, trigger, response, TRI, interrupt, interrogate. So you want to pattern interrupt. So when you go into a pattern, you want to be able to just interrupt it. And you can do this in a many number of ways. I like to do it in a funny way, because once you, like, if you're angry or if you're scared, if you go to humor, it like makes your brain go and sort of have to divert resources to be like, what's going on? So I like to hop on one foot or make like the world's most annoying, my children know this one, my world's most annoying sound. I won't do it. I will spare you for doing it in the mic, but it's basically the most awful screech you've ever heard. And I call it the world's most annoying sound. And so when my children are going into a pattern, I say, hey, do you want to hear the world's most annoying sound? And they're like, oh, mom, and I'll screech and it interrupts their pattern. So some people wear like a hair tie, like a rubber band around their wrist, and you can snap it. Pain does a great job of pulling you out of a pattern. You don't want to go overboard on that, but you get the idea. You want to just do something to bring yourself conscious. There could be something that you say to yourself. There could be a tune that you whistle. It's a pattern interrupt. And so then you ask it questions. The other I in trip is interrogate. So you want to be able to say, to question your belief around this. Like, what else could be true? Okay, is this true? Is it always true? What else could be true? And then from there, you want to come into presence and power. So when you start asking the questions, you sort of recruit your logical mind, and you can get out of your emotional brain. We want to feel our feelings, but we don't want to be hijacked by the story. And when we're in emotions, a lot of times our brain is running a story on loop. And by recruiting our logic with the interrogation process, we are able to sort of interrupt that pattern and come into presence and power. And then from there, we can choose. Hey, do I really want to break this plate that I'm getting ready to throw across the kitchen? My guess is you probably don't. All the things that we regret and feel stupid for when we're responding in a pattern, you guys, I'll tell you a funny story. So my kids give me a hard time about it. But one of the things that triggers me big time is when my kids fight. So it has to do with the chaotic family that I grew up in that was always in conflict. And so when my kids fight, I get I get angry, but anger is really the mask for fear. It triggers an old trauma. So one time not too long ago, my kids were fighting over some food. There was only a little bit left. And if you guys have kids, this is, who gets it? Who gets the last chicken nugget or whatever it was? And so I told him, 3 or 4 times in a calm voice, you guys don't fight about food. There's plenty of food. If you, figure it out, work it out between you guys. They're teenagers, so they should be able to do that. And they kept bickering. And also I was on a deadline trying to get some work done. So I came tearing out of my office and I grabbed the food and I marched into the backyard and I threw it over the fence to the chickens. So nobody got it. And my children thought that was so funny. And they said, they said that I speed waddled. So I was walking with purpose. And I thought I was, being very authoritarian and taking charge. And I was going to put an end to this bickering. And they thought it was hilarious because I was, they call it speed waddling. So now it's a big joke around my house is that, don't make mom speed waddle because, anyway. So I wish I could give you a representation of what that looked like, but this is a podcast, so you'll have to just imagine it in your mind. But obviously I felt very foolish when I calmed down for taking my children's food and speed waddling it across the yard and throwing it to the chickens. I can laugh about it now, but I assure you I was not in a funny mood when I did it. It was not intended with humor. So the way that trip works in that process is the trigger happens and I'm feeling that response of like, bubbling up. And that's where you interrupt. You can pattern interrupt before the speed waddle so that you don't make a fool out of yourself and give your teenage children ammunition to tease you with. And so that's a joke, but obviously this can be very, very serious, and abusive situations always happen in a triggered situation. Triggering can cause and perpetuate addictions. So it's not all fun and games, but I wanted to give you kind of a funny example of what this can look like. So when you interrupt and interrogate, you recruit your logical mind, and then you can choose to show up without speed waddling because nobody really needs that in their life. All right, so there's another tool I want to give you, and you've heard me talk about it before, but I'm going to share it with you here because it's appropriate, and it's the forgiveness framework. So this is the way that we feel our feelings and interact with our feelings. So the first step of the forgiveness framework is acknowledgement. What do you feel? I feel angry. What else? I feel scared. So anger is almost always a mask for fear. And you can ask what else until you kind of keep pulling those threads and get to sort of like, what am I really feeling? Another thing here is to do a body scan. So start at the top of your head and just scan down to your feet and see where it is in your body. What is it? Is there a tight area? Where is it? What does it feel like? And it's just bring your awareness to that area and ask like, what is this? And then you offer it up for healing. So this is a prayer that I'm talking to God and the Holy Spirit is, but I'm willing not to feel this. So I'm offering this up. I'm willing to give this up. I might not know how to give it up. I might not be ready to give it up, but I'm willing. So step number 2 is willingness in the forgiveness framework. And then step number 3 is release. And this is show me this from from heaven's perspective. Show me this from a healed perspective. Show me a different way. What else could be true? And then you just sit there and let a pattern turn, a story or a narrative turn around to something that is empowering and serves you. Okay, so as we do our daily emotional hygiene, we will notice wires that when activated reveal an old wound. So remember, if it's hysterical, it's historical. So what I mean by emotional hygiene is to come conscious with our emotions and stop just being run ragged by them and start to inquiry. Like, what are you thinking about? How are you feeling? And like I said, all of the episodes on emotions leading up to this gives you so many tools for emotional intelligence and awareness. I'm not going to belabor the point, but emotional hygiene is basically just a daily commitment to emotional intelligence and awareness. So as we work with and process our emotional energies out of the nervous system, we actually achieve these incredible breakthroughs. And they sometimes they are big and wonderful. We have these cathartic emotional releases and we're free of it. That often happens towards the end of a pattern. So a lot of times some smaller events and processing happen, and then we get sort of to the mother load and we're able to really just release it out. And that is such an incredible thing that happens. But not only do we get to repattern those emotions, but we get to choose how we show up. And as we heal in this way, our purpose really begins to fulfill itself, or to show itself and to reveal itself is a better way of saying that. So healing is really the predicate for your life's purpose showing up. There's nobody that I know or know of that is operating it with purpose and on mission in life that hasn't dealt with their stuff, that they've gone through this path and began to excavate their emotional reality. And as you heal, that's when purpose reveals itself. And remember, the Holy Spirit is our teacher, our guide, our advocate, and comforter. So you're not alone in doing this work. You always have that person, the person of the Holy Spirit, to help you. Just a simple request and turning your attention towards the Holy Spirit and asking for help. And the Holy Spirit is always there to guide you and to lead you and to teach you and to comfort you. All right, my friends, that is it for this episode of the Rise to Reign framework. Thank you so much for being here and listening, and I will see you in the next episode.